series of castles built by somebody called Francesco di Giorgio Martini for Federico da Montefeltro, and some he did for Montefeltro himself, and some he did for his son-in-law, Giovanni della Rovere. And this is looking from the hill down at the little village of Sassocorvado with this enormous castle, and it's the weirdest shape, a little bit like a turtle in plan. And then you go into the town and there are just these looming walls of Renaissance brickwork, and these beautiful stone window frames. They are essentially just, defensive things. And here's another one. This is so tiny. I think this was designed to be run only by like 3 soldiers or something and be completely impregnable. Really wonderful. This is, I think, in a town called Cagli, like Cagli. And then here's another one, completely geometric, and these amazing, amazing forms. 1470 or something. And you can sort of see the scale. I think there's a person walking past it on the right there, do you see? And then these are capitals also designed by Francesco di Giorgio for another of these fortresses, which was demolished. And this was another one for Giovanni della Rovere. They're so incredibly inventive. There's a sphinx sitting on somebody's helmet, and then here a shield, and here's somebody holding the della Rovere coat of arms there, you see, with the della Rovere oak in the top left quarter. And so those are in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And then, of course, in the Met in New York is this inlaid wood Studiolo, little sort of study, little room made for Federico da Montefeltro for his small palace in Gubbio. And they've kind of replicated the original room that it was in, but they haven't done anything about replicating the paintings that were above the panelling. 2 of them are in the National Gallery in London. Another one we will see later on, and they rather nicely do it with Italian sunlight coming in through the windows. But I was very interested to go and see the original room, and there's the window of it on the left, and the 2 tiny ones above it are also lighting that room. And I think they were probably very specifically put to put light onto certain bits of it. Here is the courtyard, and so it's really quite a small palace, designed by Francesco di Giorgio Martini again. None of the architectural mouldings really repeat. They're all very individual and very different. Here's a beautifully carved composite capital. And here they've even got one of the relief moulded terracotta tiles. And it's got Federico Dux. He was made the Duke of Urbino by the Pope, I think, in 1474 or something, and he died in 82. He was a condottiero. He was a sort of a mercenary warlord who you could hire to fight for you. Actually, as it turns out, he was not the shining beacon of humanism that we all thought he was, and he turns out to have been the moving force behind the Pazzi conspiracy, where they tried to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. But this tile has got Federico Dux, and then it's got these emblems, tongues of flame, and this was some sort of society that he was a member of when he was young, and he used that as one of his main emblems. And anyway, here is the room the Met's Studiolo came out of, and then here the great big window, and then the smaller windows up the top. I did find it very moving to go there, having spent so many happy hours looking at that room in the Met, to go and see the weird sort of ruined shell that it came out of was rather a moving moment. And there's the small upper window on the right, and you can see it's at this very specific angle. And I'm not sure what that's about, but maybe it was to get a specific bit of light onto a specific bit of the painted decoration on the other side of the room. One of the figures, each of the muses, the muse of rhetoric and the muse of astronomy, and Montefeltro's son Guidobaldo and other young men approaching these muses, and Federico himself as well, but his one has been destroyed, the painting. But here's the actual panelling in the Met, trompe-l'oeil in tarsia, with these half-open lattice doors revealing all of his special stuff inside. Originally, I think the wood had a bit of colour, and now there's very occasionally you can see a tiny hint of colour, but most of it is just different colours of wood. And there's Federico's helmet with his eagle crest on top, sitting firmly in a cupboard because he doesn't use it anymore. And there's his English Order of the Garter. The moment it was made a Knight of the Garter, he put it on everything. And this brush was another of his emblems. What the meaning of the brush was, I can't remember, but I think there was a story that it was to clean up his reputation. He was actually illegitimate, and he was made legitimate by the Pope, and the Pope sort of said, oh no, it's fine, absolutely. God totally approved of your father. And then here an ermine, all these emblems are frightfully meaningful. And here he is on the right with his wife Battista Sforza, who was the daughter of the man who became Duke of Milan. That's a famous double portrait by Piero della Francesca that's in the Uffizi, with his very distinctive nose. There was a tournament actually to celebrate his father-in-law being made Duke of Milan, held in Urbino. Federico had a romantic liaison with a lady who he'd met, who was not his wife. They'd had this liaison under an oak tree. He wasn't really going to compete in the tournament, and he decided he'd better, for her, to show. And so he tied bits of oak leaves and oak branches onto his armour, and in order to hold it in his helmet, he had the visor up. And so as a result of having the visor up in order to show off to his new lady friend, then his opponent's lance took out one of his eyes, his right eye, and the top of his nose. I love those wonderful hairdos. And then just other incredibly famous, unbelievably beautiful paintings by Piero della Francesca of him. This is after, I think, Battista has died. This was some very famous new suit of armour that he'd had made. And then here he is with Guidobaldo, his son, and he's reading from one of his famous books, and he had this incredible library. Here he is again, painted in miniature in one of his books. This is the painting that was part of the upper wall of the Studiolo that is now in the Met. The perspective is exactly right. Probably it was on the end wall when you go into the room. And that painting was bought by Queen Victoria. And now we're going to Urbino, and so his capital and his great palace with the mountains in the background. The two towers on the right mark his private apartments, and then you can see this wall with these window openings which open onto a garden on the other side of the wall. And along the top of that wall was a walkway, so he could walk from his apartment, which is on the right where the towers are, to the Duchess's apartment on the left. And I'm completely obsessed with this walkway. I'm fascinated by it. And so there you can see his apartment, that little sort of projecting bay thing on the left there. And then there was a door in the tower, and he could walk along where that roof is. Here from below, you can still see the corbels on top of the wall. And if you take the roof off and you imagine there's a balustrade up there, and Sir Federico could walk along there in the open air, and this sort of mad kind of bridge thing across. And then from her apartment, they could process into the church, and there was a bridge going directly into the gallery of the church. The front of the palace is such a mess. It was never properly finished. You can see they've started doing stone cladding along the basement story, and they had got nowhere near finishing it. And then, unfortunately, an extra story was added by the Della Roveres later on, and so it used to have castellations. Must have looked so beautiful before. But still, there are these incredibly beautiful marble door surrounds and window surrounds. And then here's the fantastic courtyard, which is just a dream. Francesco di Giorgio Martini, again, adding on to work that was started by somebody else called Francesco Laurana. And here's the great staircase, carved coat of arms. Amazing, these window frames. I mean, the detail of them is extraordinary. Look at this door frame. And then we've got Dux for Duke, you see. And then here, there's an early capital when he was still a count. And it's got FC for Federico Gomez. Here on a door frame, here's again his Order of the Garter on an open book. And then one of his famous bindings on one of his books below. What are these? Well, there's his brush again hanging. You see the top hanging from those wings. Look at the quality of that work. It's unbelievable. And I won't show you most of the rooms because they are all National Gallery of the Marche, and so they're full of beautiful paintings, but the lighting is terrible. But this room on the ground floor leads through towards his two tiny chapels, humanist chapels, they think. And so here there's a sort of a message on the door frame composed by his court poet. And then this very beautiful floor that's left here leading out. And here looking through into one of the chapels. And on the door frame it says something about Ottavio Ubaldini, who was, I think, was his illegitimate half-brother or something, and was his sort of advisor, kind of the brains behind the throne. And then this is the interior of one of those chapels. Everything of value has been removed from it, including the lettering, which it was probably gold or something, I don't know. Maybe it was just gilt bronze, but it's been prized out, do you see, of the frieze. And so we're just left with the more of that floor leading out onto one of the fantastic balconies. And so you go through from the courtyard, move through this sequence of rooms and out onto the balcony. Here are those balconies. Oh no, that one on the bottom there, I think, is from his bathrooms. And so he had these amazing bathrooms. And he had a plunge bath and a warm room and all sorts of things, very healthy. His own spa. And it's just full of all these wonderful open windows and these simple white curtains blowing in the wind now. And these lovely little marble seats so you could sit and look out. And this is the only survivor of the painted decoration of the palace, which is this room which is ringed with, I think they're meant to be his ancestors or something. And it obviously was rather wonderful. Trompe-l'oeil painting once upon a time, but this is about all that's left, sadly. But what are really left are these wooden doors, which are incredible. They're everywhere. And they are unbelievably beautiful and massive and sort of amazing technology and still work perfectly. And all the sort of locks that were done, in 1470 are still working. I mean, they are extraordinary. And this is all this marquetry, inlaid wood. I think this one is supposed to have been designed by Botticelli. And there's a little bit of green left stained there in that skirt of that military gentleman. There's a diamond ring from the Medici. I don't know whether he thought he'd have them murdered and then he'd steal their ring. I don't know. And then here, a lady with a couple of snakes. You can see just how much the Della Rovere spoilt the palace by adding those 2 top stories for the courtiers and servants. And then this is just a little ceiling of this weird little space leading into his Studiolo, which is the most famous room. And so this is the plan. And so on the left bottom, do you see there's the spiral stair in one of those towers down to the 2 little chapels, or down further to his bathroom complex, or from here into his bedroom and dressing room, and then into that thing that I've coloured brown because that's the Studiolo. So you can see that the balcony actually opens out from the Studiolo. And I don't have any general views of it, I'm afraid, because every time I go there are horrible perspex screens in place and ugly sort of signs and things. And there's the entrance door. Here in the corner there is Federico, and his armour is very significantly hanging up in a cupboard on the right because he's not using it anymore. So he's a man of peace, and so his spear is reversed. There's an exploding grenade, which was one of his emblems. And he has one of the cupboards open, which is rather nice to see just how basic the interior of the cupboard is. And this was just to hold his stationery stuff, I suppose. In this corner there was a fantastic pull-out desk and seat, which was a sort of fantastic early piece of office furniture. Here's one of the other cupboards, and that obviously had more precious things in and was for showing to visitors, and so it's got a rather beautiful design on the inside of the cupboard door. And this is where the desk pulls down. You see that thing that's made to look like a velvet cushion. That's actually a panel in the panelling, and you can unhook it, and it hinges down as the desk flap. And then there's a great big seat that pulls out of the wall so that he could sit and do his work. And then this is looking up. This is an image I put together with the paintings that are in the room now, and there are, I can't remember, 8 or 10 or something of the original paintings, and then the other ones that are in the Louvre. And so I took my photograph of the ones from the Louvre and photoshopped them onto here in colour, which is a rather silly thing to do, really, isn't it? They're all great thinkers in conversation. And some of them are people he knew, and some of them are historic characters, and some of them are legendary characters. And there's a whole programme of why they're there and what they're talking about. The outer door, I think, doesn't open any longer. But imagine that once upon a time, you could open this door and then the outer door, and you were out on the balcony. From that incredibly refined wooden interior, you'd step out onto this wonderful balcony with this fantastic view. And you can see how excited I get when I go there. But the balcony is extraordinary. So there is that top balcony